where we left off, the first 2,000 years of Jewish history, beginning with Abraham, our forefather, going down to Egypt, Jews coming out, going to the land of Israel, building the first temple, being exiled by the Babylonians, coming back in the time of the Persians, rebuilding the temple, undergoing the period of the Greeks, then the Romans, then the destruction of the second temple. And then by the year 70 is where we're up to now, a little bit later than 70. We even covered after the destruction, the beginning of the formulation of the oral law. When I say beginning, as far as making it into specific works that would then be written down for the first time in about the year 200 after the destruction. So here we are. Let's take a look. I'm going to share the screen and we will go to our slideshow, see how that works. Okay, let's see if is this showing up? I think it is. All right. So from the Jewish people are now located in two lands, in Babylon and in Israel primarily. There are Jews living also in Egypt and some other places as well. But primarily the land of Israel and Babylon. And as the land of Israel, the Jewish people shrunk due to the Christian persecution. They ended up moving to Babylon mostly. So by the time the year 350, you have still the Jerusalem Talmud is concluded. But after that, it becomes a much smaller Jewish community, lots of persecution. And the Jewish community in Babylon, where they end up finalizing the Talmud about the year 500. So we're going to go back and forth like a ping pong ball between the intellectual history of the Jewish people and their political history and some of their cultural history as well. So here we are with the close of the Talmudic period, about 500. The Talmud then has a little bit of editing done to it. But that period until what comes next is going to be the Muslim period. So just an overview of the Talmud. The Mishnah is the oral tradition written down in a way to memorize in short, succinct. The Talmud is the elaboration. So there always existed the concept of elaboration, but as a text and as the debate of clarifying different elements becomes the Talmud. The Talmud is a great big, we call it the sea of the Talmud, and it's a mix of Jewish law, biblical interpretation, stories of the sages, moral and ethics. It's not just one thing. All right, so the Jerusalem Talmud is completed about 350, the Babylonian about 500 of the Common Era. What happens next is Islam. Islam, we have debate among different historians exactly what his influences were they some form of Judaism, or were they from elements of Christianity that had taken from Judaism. But one thing is clear, that he has many midrashim, many stories of the Jewish tradition that he integrated. So Yosef and Moshe are very much part of the Quran. He's living among pagans, and he adopts Jewish practices to attract the Jews. There are Jews there, living there in Arabia when he begins this new religion. So they pray towards Jerusalem, they fast on Yom Kippur, they keep similar to kosher laws, circumcision. But the Jews don't end up following him. So what happens is they reject it. And you can see, his ignorance of the Bible based on different people, Haman ending up in the Pesach story, in the biblical time, all different elements of Jewish people, despite he came with the sword and with success and with power, the Jewish people as a whole were not impressed with these new religions that were coming their way. And once again, they rejected his claim as a prophet. So he gets upset and he changes the direction to Mecca, Shabbos to Friday, all these different elements, he says, and they begin to change they say the Torah was changed by the Jews. And really Ishmael was the one bound on the altar, etc. So he expels Jewish tribes, he kills members of another, and there's all sorts of trickery involved. So he calls them corrupters of scripture. They become the enemy as well. So this is the initial reaction. But Islam, ultimately, when it takes power, it creates this rules for pagans versus the people of the book, who are both Jews and Christians. They're both called people of the book. That term that we like, people of the book, comes from the Quran, comes from the Muslims describing Jews and Christians. So they call them dhimmis, protected subjects, but they always have to acknowledge their subservience to Islam and to Muslims. They have to pay a special head tax. They couldn't carry weapons. They couldn't ride on horses. They couldn't build synagogues or churches unless they got special permission. And Islam was very successful, managed to pull together all these pagan Arabs, and nation after nation, accept their religion and gets folded in to the cause. By 700, North Africa was conquered. 711, Spain fell under Islam, and Islamic expansion stops in 732. So by mid-18th century, most of the world Jews lived in the Islamic Empire. This is, it's hard for us to imagine, but most Jews were under Islam at the point, because the Middle East and even parts of Europe were under the Islamic rule, where there were some Jews there. Spain, North Africa. All right. So they live, by the way, in this also, they're under one cultural, economic, and political system that allows the Gaonim, the leaders of the Jews who succeeded the Talmudic sages called Amoraim, who succeeded the Tanaic, the Mishnah sages called Tanaim, who succeeded the men of the Great Assembly, who succeeded the prophets, who succeeded the judges, going all the way back to Moshe. So the Gaonim, who sat in Babylon, are able to rule the Jewish people because under one cultural, economic, and political system. And that allows them easily access to all the Jews. It also means in times of persecution, everyone can be in trouble at the same time, as you will see. So the Islamic Empire expands, and this is the where most of the Jewish world is. Just to give the timeline, so what you have here in Spain, you have which is going to be a fundamental place, for the Jewish people. You're going to have the early Christian period, the Muslim period, and then when they reconquer from mid-12th century till 1492, that will be the Christians again. So we have Christians, Muslims, Christians in Spain. And Spain's going to play a central role for the Jewish life of the last 1,000 years. The Jewish life of the last 1,000 years is we're going to get to where the 2,000 years ago, but the last 1,000 years is Germany, which becomes the Ashkenazic Jews, and Spain, which will become the Sephardic Jews. So meanwhile, though, we're still in Babylon. In Babylon, the Muslims take over. But then when there's infighting among different Muslim tribes, so as they weaken and as there's more massacres and problems, the Jews who are living in Babylon and Iraq, ancient Babylon, begin to move. So there's Jewish communities in Egypt and then ultimately in Spain, North Africa first. So there's this movement taking place. There are already Jews in Italy from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. Jews were taken there as slaves. So the Jews of Italy end up, as we'll see, becoming primarily a source for Ashkenazic Jewry, for German Jews, as the Romans go into Germany. and the Jews of Spain will meld back into what we call the Eastern world, the Mizrahi Jews, coming all together. So by the mid-5th century, the Roman Empire fell to Germanic tribes, Franks and Visigoths in Spain. So first they were tolerant and then became less tolerant when they became Roman Catholic. They began to forcibly convert Jews. And what happened was, when the Visigoths were forcibly converting the Jews to Catholicism, so some fled to France and North Africa, right down here. Others converted, and some practiced Judaism in secret. This is like the first example of Marranos. Okay, the term Marrano may not yet have been used, but these were, in other words, pre-Islamic Spain, this is the Visigoths, already you had these forced conversions of Jews. So, but then the Muslims invade Spain, and because of the persecution of the Jews by the Visigoths, the Jews welcome the Muslims. And what happens is the Muslims end up ushering in a golden age in that period. There are different periods of Islam, just like with different periods of Christianity. There are different groups of Islam, just like different groups of Christianity. And among Islam, you have, today we know the Shiites and the Sunnis, and then we have the Sufis or the whirling dervishes. So even today, you can have some groups that are less radical than others. And what happens here in this period in Spain, so this caliph, this ruler of Spain, makes it a major political and cultural center. And separate from Baghdad, and it becomes its own empire and invites scholars, poets, and the Jews were protected there. And what happens is the Jewish community begins to grow. In this period, we have Chazai Ibn Shaprut. He's a poet, he sponsors Torah scholars, and he even ends up communicating with the Jews in Italy and France, and a fascinating excursion in Jewish history. I don't know why it keeps on doing that. A fascinating excursion of Jewish history is when he sends a letter to a kingdom of Khazaria. Khazaria was a kingdom in between the Muslims and the Christians that converted to Judaism. And they were a power in between the Christians and the Muslims. And ultimately they get, the Russians wipe them out. But the point, though, is there's an independent kingdom of Jews. Most, of course, are converts, but others, rabbis that come here to teach them. So this court Jew, head of the Spanish Jewish community, sends a letter. We have copies of that letter today. So he's poetry. I'll just get one example of a person. I'll go through a few different people. Asai Chazdai, beginning of that period of a development of Jewish life in Spain. So you have an element here of acculturation, and this is an important element in every diaspora of the Jewish people. You have reaction or acculturation or assimilation. Sometimes we're debating and we're rejecting the values of the dominant culture. Sometimes we're integrating elements. So the Muslims at that time, the Arabic writers of that time, were very deft and tremendous ability in poetry that ended up influencing the Jewish community as well and how they wrote poetry. There was different types of prose in the Torah, King David, but then there's poetry with all the different rules of poetry. That encounter begins to a great degree with the influence by Arabic poetry. In form, substance is always a danger of how much are you culturally taking from the surrounding society. So sometimes you go too far and you're assimilating. So this is always the delicate balance of Jewish history. And this pushback when you go too far, like we find with the Maccabee story, or we find, as we'll see soon, with philosophy. And what's the limit is always the question. And it's always a pushback, and that's normal. Because if you want to hold on to tradition, you have to be very careful about foreign influences integrating into the system. All right, so the golden age of Spain is culture, it is philosophy. They translate the Greek works, and the Jewish people read this and they write philosophy. And of course, he mentions the poetry. We have Shlomo ibn Gabriel is a famous one. Shmuel HaNagid is a great, amazing story. He becomes the general of the Islamic army of the time, patron to the Jewish community, supporting Jewish scholars. Let me see, someone's chatting. Okay, right arrow. Right, that's what I'm doing wrong. So this Shmuel HaNagid becomes the leader of the Jewish people. He's also a Torah scholar. But his son, as we'll see soon, in this palace intrigue, when you're in a place of power, and in this Muslim country, his son gets massacred after his death. His son gets killed together with a bunch of other Jews in a pogrom of sorts by the Muslims. There were those that were not happy that a Jew was second in command in their country, despite his successes as a general. And there are many beautiful stories about him as well. But the point is, Jews, as Jews, keeping the highest level of religiosity, were able to be successful in the Muslim Spain. They were not crushed and pushed down totally. Of course, there were problems. There was still the dhimmi status at different times, but there were periods, like the golden period of Spain, where the Jewish people were able to rise to these heights of society. So here's one other famous philosopher, Yehuda Halevi. He writes a book of philosophy, which is really not philosophy, but really what it is it's a book of anti-philosophy, where he talks about revelation. He shows how the Jewish people's unique quality, he makes it a debate, as if he's debating with the king of the Khazars, that famous kingdom that had converted a couple hundred years earlier, as if he's part of a debate with a Christian, with a Muslim, with a philosopher, with a Karaite, and they're all discussing what is a true religion. He makes this fictitious work, clearly, but it's like a dialogue, and it's a conversation about the values of each religion. And he defends Judaism, and one of his primary elements, he talks about revelation, prophecy, etc., and what makes Judaism unique. So this is it's composed in Arabic. The language of the Jews is Arabic, as well, of course, as Hebrew, but their conversation is Arabic, and they're very much part and parcel of that culture. America, in our day, is the closest approximation of what we had at that time. Although America, of course, has a greater level of equality, but it did exist there to a great degree. If we're going to use ancient history as an example, of course, there are many differences, as we all know. Okay, we're going to go further. We don't have to read everything of his poetry. So we spoke about how, there were massacres and his son is killed and other Jews. The Rambam is another the great eagle, as he's called, but he suffers from Almohads, other Islamic tribes that sweep in and conquer different areas. So we find the Rambam, he's born in Cordoba, Spain, and he traces his ancestry to King David. His father is a judge. But the Almohads, who are fanatic Muslims, they invade Spain. Some say they're doing forced conversion at the time. And the Rambam's family is forced to flee, and they wander in Spain, because they go up above, it is the northern part of Spain, which was still under Christian rule. And then 1160, they settle in Fez, Morocco. Then he moves to Israel. So he's one of the examples of the wandering Jew. The truth is, we could spend a whole talk just on the Rambam himself, and if he wasn't known as one person, we would see him as a university. He is the leader of the Jewish community. He becomes a physician to the Sultan in Egypt. He has medical writings, but what he's known for us for is his works on the Torah. He writes a commentary in the Mishnah while he's on a boat. He writes, "I don't have my books with me because I'm missing my. I'm on a boat fleeing from Morocco to Egypt." So we even have his handwriting, drafts of it found in the Cairo Geniza. of his commentary and Mishnah. Again, written in Arabic. Again, writing for the Jew of his time, not the scholars necessarily. Scholars, all Hebrew is their first reading language, not the Jewish scholars, so to speak. The Mishnah Torah, it was somehow out of order, but let me see if I can find it. First he creates a book of mitzvahs, where there's a tradition in the Talmud that there are 630 mitzvahs in the Torah. If you go and you look in the Torah itself, you could find hundreds more, if not thousands, of detailed commandments. I think it's on automatic, the slides, but maybe I can hit pause. There's a tradition, though, that is 613, and all the rest are subcategories. And Maimonides spends a lot of time to figure out what are the 613 fundamental laws of the Torah, because this will allow him and create a template for him to write a code of Jewish law. He felt something very missing from Judaism was in an organized way that every person can be able to access the works, the laws of the Torah, instead of looking at the Talmud and trying to pull out pieces and figure out the law. He wants to reformat all of the laws and traditions of Judaism, and he does it. 14 volumes, an incredible work called the Yad HaChazaka, the strong arm. Hebrew 14 is yad, his hand, so arm. But what is the story with the Rambam? So the Rambam does this all alone, but he writes, this is the work he writes in Hebrew, and he sees it almost as a second Mishnah. And it becomes an important work in Judaism, although not as important as he would have liked, because others follow in his footsteps and adapt and create as we go along in Jewish history. He also writes a book of philosophy, helping integrate, or those who had questions about Greek philosophy, those who were immersed in Greek philosophy and wanted to reconcile it with Torah. He writes a guide for the perplexed, also written in Arabic. You have all these works written in Arabic. This one was controversial because many felt he was opening a doorway for Greek philosophy to enter into the Jewish world, which many felt that there were elements of it that were antagonistic. Although the Rambam massaged and modified elements that were not compatible, nevertheless, they saw it, though, as an opening way that would allow others to start studying philosophy and heretical works as being kosher and being acceptable. And many of the works were heretical, not the Rambams, but others. So people had issues with his work, and this went on for a couple hundred years. But this is, again, the class of cultures, is that the Rambam, many years after the Hellenists, which is the story of the Maccabees, we're talking now, 1,000 to 1,200 years later, where we fought against Hellenist influence. Now, through the Kalam, the Arabic philosophers who were taking, just as the Christian philosophers before took Greek philosophy and looked at the Torah through that lens, so too also the Muslims were doing it. And the Rambam used it as a tool to be able to teach those who are enamored with Greek philosophy how they could still be totally loyal to Torah. What people struggle with today, sometimes with different issues, how do you reconcile different values or ways of looking at the world with the Torah? The challenge always is, when we are engaged in apologetics, is what happens for future generations and even for your own generation. If you water down Torah to fit with the ism of the time, even if you twist it to fit into a certain box, there may be unforeseen consequences in future times when they see them as intertwined and they're rejecting Greek philosophy. What happens then to the guide for the perplexed? These are all challenges, and I'm not resolving them now. I'm just throwing them out there about this constant balance and pushback towards integration and towards engagement with other cultures. So we'll leave the Rambam. The end of the golden age is what we have with 1200. Now the Jews do okay initially under the Christians, as we'll see. But what happens is when the Arabs leave, the Jews need to, let me go back for a second. The Jews begin to translate these works into Hebrew that were written in Arabic. And only the most popular works got translated. Who knows how many we lost. So there's this element where we're no longer under Arab rule. There's going to be Christian Spain and Christian Europe as well. So I have to say there's a fundamental difference in general between Islam and Christianity's engagement with the Jews. For the Muslim, the Jew was a people of the book like the Christians. They believed that the Jews had corrupted the Torah and that they had the real thing in the Quran. The Christians saw themselves as replacing the Jews as the people of Israel, as replacement in general. And that did lead to a much more harsh relationship between the Christian countries and the Jews and the Muslim countries and the Jews. In general, there were always exceptions. There was never a rose garden under anybody. Exile is not good, as we'll see. All right, so there were Jews in medieval Christian Europe. So what we have here is, as the we have the Ashkenazic Jewry, Germany and France. They begin to develop in the 900s approximately. So you have this idea of the Jew as other in early Christian thought. And there were different church doctrines. Though the Jews were protected, they have a right to worship, but they can't say anything negative. They can't try to convert. That was part of their doctrine. And Augustine legitimized Jewish existence, and he said that the Jewish people's survival is a sign that that their suffering is a sign that we have the real deal. But as the Jewish community grows, the question would be, what would they tolerate or persecute? And there were many underlying reasons of peasants and others who had issues with the Jews who were caught in between the nobility and the serfs that allows anti-Semitism to grow. So at a certain point when they call a crusade, and a lot of this was for economic reasons and political reasons, not pure religion, and if you explore the crusades, but nevertheless, they want to go and free Israel from the Holy Land from the Muslims. But what happens is the Crusaders say, why should we go to Israel, to the Holy Land, to get rid of the Muslims? We could go down the Rhine Valley, and there's lots of Jews there. They're also infidels. And they put them to the sword or the cross. This is the Crusades. And there were different crusades throughout the history. And among the concerns that they had was there were elements of, they didn't want Judaizing, where Jews they were afraid the Jews would influence them, but also there were other elements as well. They didn't want the Christians to work in Jewish homes, to marry them.
Century, the church under Pope Innocent III.
So there are different things that happen when we try to go through it, because I don't want to be stuck on this. You have the burning of the Talmud. An incredible thing is that as they become more literate and they start reading Jewish works, but part of this attempt to convert the Jew was to get rid of the oral law, get rid of the Torah. Now everything was manuscripts. These things were written by hand, and they were rare and they were integral to Jewish life. This was the portable homeland of the Jew. So Pope Gregory says the Talmud, puts the Talmud on trial. This is after some forced disputations with the Jews about Christianity, about Judaism, about why the Jews cling to the Torah and reject the belief in Jesus. So what they do is they put the Talmud on trial, and they find the Talmud guilty, and they collect and they kick in doors, and under pain of death, and they take 40 cartloads of the Talmud burned in Paris, right in the plaza in front of the Notre Dame. So this is the treasure of the Jewish people being burned, but there were people being burned too. So, but this really was a challenge. It was an attack on the religion as a whole and the Jewish people as a whole. But this is just an example. There are many others. So the Jewish people, one of the forms of business they were able to do, because Christians would not lend each other money on interest, the Jews become the money lenders. And also the Jews have connections with Jews in other countries. It's a ability for there to be a credit and all sorts of commercial usages of having relatives spread out in a diaspora. beyond just local walls. So the Jew was allowed to lend according to Christian belief, but it also put the Jew in a position where princes and kings owed them lots of money and nobility, and there was always an incentive to burn the Jew and burn his debts that you owed to him. So there was, even if the church wasn't always antagonistic, you had nobility that was antagonistic. And then you had peasantry that was antagonistic because, as we'll see at different times, the Jew becomes the middleman between the nobility and the peasant. They run an estate. The Jew wasn't allowed to own land. He was forced into these different ways of earning a living that on one hand is protected, and on the other hand, though, becomes the enemy of the people. So I don't really want to focus on a history of anti-Semitism. So despite the fact that many of the slides have that, I collected slides from a bunch of places, and it's not like everything here is what I would naturally focus on. So I'm going to go through some of them a little bit quicker than others. And you'll excuse me, because otherwise I can't see as we go through. So we have the missionary targets, the belief that if you converted the Jew, that was the ultimate fulfillment of Christianity. And if it's the truth, even forced sermons, forced debates, and sometimes forced conversions were done as well. The famous debate of Nachmanides, where he recounts his disputation, was the only time in Jewish history where the King James of Aragon gave permission for the Jew to answer in a way that he wouldn't be charged with blasphemy. Every debate was, the rules of the Jew against the Jews were, you could debate, but you can't say anything that might be insulting to Christianity. Because if you do, we're going to make a program. If we do, we're going to expel you. And the only time in history, in this medieval history, that you were allowed to have a dispute and you wouldn't be killed was Nachmanides. But at the conclusion, when the King James saw Nachmanides had won, still the Dominicans put pressure on him to kill Maimonides or expel him, and he had to leave and go to Israel. This is the only time there was some level of freedom in debate. So we have the Disputation of Barcelona. There's even a movie of it, but this happened many, many, many times, and usually did not end as well as this. They usually ended with forced conversions or expulsion or massacres. Pick your poison. So there was a claim among Christians, part of the blood libels, that they believe that Jesus is put into the host. So they believe somehow that the Jew was so satanic, that the Jew was so that the Jew was so believed in Christianity, but was just evil. So they believed the Jew would try to kill Jesus again by stabbing the wafer. And there were all sorts of claims about this issue, and they would then massacre Jews or expel Jews or forcibly convert them. And then there was the blood libel, where they made up stories that the Jews were using for matzah. And it's based on the notion that Jews hate Christianity, hate Christians, and they want to keep on killing their God. But either way, it was an excuse to rile up the masses for different reasons, political, economic, and religious at times. But this was the motif able to be used in Christian lands at times. Okay? There were infamous blood libels, expulsions and burnings. Every country, England burned the Jews alive in the Crusades. France, they expelled them. Every country expelled and murdered. And all right, that's Europe. Now, the reality is there were 50 years, 70 years of quiet in certain places where they lived wonderful, rich lives. How long have we been since the Holocaust, God forbid? The point is, when we look back through the Black Book of Jewish history and we see everything as a history of massacres and all that, we're not doing justice. It was an incredible time of productive Jewish learning and life and family and meaning and community in all this period as well. But this is an historical perspective. These events stand out stronger. If we do, and when we do, an intellectual history and an internal history, you're able to focus more on the rich inner life of the Jewish people of that time. Incredible literacy. They all were learning and studying and living rich Jewish lives in a hostile environment. Under Christianity or under Islam, those were the two choices. So we have in the Spanish Inquisition, what happens is by 1248, all of Spain is in Christian hands, except Granada in the south. In the south. And when they reconquest when the Christians reconquer it, So the Jews were welcomed by the Christians. They were happy because the Jews knew the terrain and they were not seen as a threat like the Muslims. And the Jews made it very high in Christian Spain as well. It was also a continuation of that golden age. But it stirred resentment, both among the nobility and among the masses. And the Jews then also served as tax collectors. And the kings who wanted to protect them and went against the church doctrine of Augustine that the Jewish people are supposed to be in a lowly, despised state. So there were different kings and rulers who were moved to be much more anti-Semitic than they otherwise would be. But there were Jews at the time of the expulsion that were at the leadership. Jewish people were successful in Christian Spain as well, until they weren't anymore. So they first started censoring the Talmud, and then they began to do more missionizing activities, Dominicans and friars, and they began to study Hebrew texts. We had the forced disputations that took place. After the Black Death in Germany in particular, Jews were accused of poisoning the wells, and the Jews then leave Egypt and go into Poland. After 1300 is when this flow begins. So I would just say, again, we have many amazing scholars and works of rich Jewish literature in all these times. The Jews lived with the ongoing sporadic and not so sporadic persecution, or God forbid worse, at different times. And don't forget, non-Jews were dying in tremendous numbers as well. The Black Death and all these other things were killing people indiscriminately. Although, they claim the Jews suffered a little bit less because they had more hygiene is the theory. But either way, everyone's looking for someone to blame, which is why we have to be careful in times of plague, because there are always masses looking for someone to blame. But you have these anti-Jewish riots in Spain. You have this preacher that aroused the people against the king, and they burnt the synagogues and destroyed the communities of 1391. And to save their lives, many Jews converted to Christianity. And what happens then is some of them, these were all under duress or they would have died. So what happens is they start keeping Judaism secretly. And so some gave up on their Judaism. They became Christians sincerely. They gave up. Many intended to remain Jewish and thought they could hide as Jews. And what happens, though, is these new Christians, till now they were Jews, and now they're these new Christians, and they're able to move up very quickly in the into the halls of power. And there's a lot of jealousy about that. In addition, the backsliding of some of these Jews, keeping Judaism secretly, and then influencing their brethren to return to Judaism. In other words, Jews were forcibly converted, influencing their other brethren who had been converted to keep Judaism secretly or to return to Judaism secretly. So this was a concern for the church and what becomes the Inquisition. And they began to distinguish between old Christians and new Christians, the first racist attitude towards Jews. And the reason why I say it's the first racist, because even those who had converted to Christianity and were loyal Christians were still seen as different. Of course, after the expulsion, it was even more so. It's a development of a racial theory of Judaism for the first time. So what happens is that these Jews who are forced at a certain point, you have the Inquisition of trying to, it's not against the Jews per se, it's rather against those Jews who had converted to Christianity. And there's they're forced to confess their sins under torture, and then they're burnt in auto de foi, an act of faith it was called. There are even some done in the Americas, Portugal, Spain, etc. So the problem though is that the Jewish people, there were those that were keeping it secretly, but many more were not forcibly converted. They were living as Jews. And there was a movement to get rid of all the Jews once and for all, because they felt this way we'll be able to disconnect the new Christians, the Marranos, both groups, from the traditional Jewish community, and they'll become good Christians. And the truth is, after a couple of generations, even if some of them were maybe precursors to Hebrew Christians, in other words, they kept certain elements of Judaism, certain elements of Christianity, ultimately they all get lost into Christianity. You can't keep it going as a secret Jew for a long time. So they decide to expel the Jews. 1492, Ocean Blue. The Jews are expelled from Spain. And although they're taking down statues of Columbus, there's fascinating debate of was he a descendant of Marranos? Was he a mixed hybrid Jewish Christian of some sort? His great-grandparents have been Jews, according to some. And this writ of expulsion, Abarbanel tries to stop and is not successful. All right, I'm going to have to move faster than this. So the Spanish exiles move into what we first into Portugal, but then into the Arab countries. So there's a repollination of the Jewish people coming into the Arab world. And the Jews of the Sephardic of Spain were so sophisticated, so cultured, so educated. When they came to the Jews of the Arab lands, their traditions end up taking root there in a way that others, the Berber Jews and others, all Jewish cultures become impacted and influenced by these newcomers. So Abarbanel is one of them. So it's the final expulsion of the Jews from Europe. And Spanish Jewry had thought they were the bee's knees. They were the strongest, wealthiest, most acculturated. And for hundreds of years, they had been there and created incredible works of literature and of life, and the highest levels of the government all gone. The debate, where, why, how? Some say, and this debate, what happened here? Why was it half of the Spanish Jews, when given the choice of expulsion, converted to Christianity? Huge numbers when given the choice at the end. Now, the truth is, many of those expelled get killed and murdered and persecuted and expelled again. The people who stayed behind and converted had their wealth, had all these, they had Inquisition holding over their head, but whether if they stayed good Christians, they'd be safe with everything. But why was it that the Jews of Europe, Germany, and France were willing to be burnt at the stake and willing to be murdered by the Crusaders and forced conversion, and the Jews of Spain, many of them convert? So one theory, I can't answer this for sure, one theory is that under Islam, which was seen as monotheistic, it was not considered a mortal sin to be a hiding as a convert, pretending to be a Muslim. And as soon as you had freedom, you could go be a good Jew again. It wasn't like worshiping idols. But under the Catholic religion, it was seen to convert to Christianity under Catholicism was for sure seen by the European Jews as a form of idol worship, so they avoided it. But the Jews of Spain had already gotten used to, for hundreds of years earlier, under Islam and under earlier Christianity, of living as Marranos, either because of forced conversion or because of Islamic conversion. So it was easier for them to do. That's one theory. Another theory is that they had become so acculturated as far as philosophy that they saw the symbolism of Judaism as being of paramount importance, and they were willing to put aside some of the justification was to put aside some of the ritual and live as non-Jews, but they would one day come back, although, like we know, most did not come back. Most ended up being swallowed up, although you could find people still to this day in New Mexico lighting candles Friday night and have no reason, no understanding why their mother used to do it in the basement, hidden, concealed. There's a book called The Mezuzah and the Madonna's Foot, where the family would always kiss the Madonna's foot, and they had a mezuzah hidden there. This type of hybrid did not last, and ultimately they all became Christians. All right, so let's leave the Inquisition alone for a moment. Eastern European Jewry. So I do want to finish. So Eastern European Jewry. So I just want to say, what you had is Sephardic Jewry is created and sustained by the Spanish Jews that come out into the Jews of the Arab lands. But the Jews of the Arab lands are a much older community. Already from the time of the Talmud, they lived in Iraq, and they lived in Egypt, and they lived in North Africa, and there was constant communication between them. Spain was linked to those communities. Spain was linked to the Jewish communities of North Africa. Spain was linked through that to Babylon, and there are thousands of letters that we have fragments of that go back to 500, 600, 700, 800, 900 from the center of Jewish life when it was centralized in Babylon, going to the Jews of North Africa, and it filters through to Spain. So the Jewish community in Spain and North Africa is united with the communities of Babylon, which was the Talmudic heritage, the heritage of ancient Jewry in a way that was not as independent as the Eastern and West European Jews. Eastern and West European Jews come from where? Where do they end up? So on one foot, it seems primarily the Jews in the Second Temple end up in Italy. Many tens of thousands of slaves and more move there. Italy, we know of yeshivas that were in Italy, in Rome, and ultimately the Roman legions, when they go down to Germany and they conquer that region, those regions, there are Jews that follow. But the first time you hear of organized Jewish communities in Europe, in not Spain, but in Germany and France and Western Europe, is the 900s. I mean, you have some in the 700s in Spain, and some of them flee to France and Germany in that period. But it's not a vibrant community with leadership in yeshivas that we know of. There were Jews. There were Jews there, from any time that after the exile, there were Jews in every corner of the earth. But communities grow and flourish with centers of Jewish life, and we know about them that way. So it's hard to know. But the Jews are not in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe. They're in Germany and France, and this is where the great schools of the Tosafists are. And that's where they bear the brunt of the Crusades. But after the Black Death, when the Jews are massacred and blamed for that, many migrate into Poland, and that becomes the center of Jewish life. They said, Poland, here we will rest. In Hebrew, Po, here, Lin, we will rest. They saw it as a good place, and it was a good place for much of the 1,000 years. Again, the Jewish definition of good is we understand that there are upheavals and there's massacres and pogroms and anti-Semitism every once in a while. But in general, Poland was, for much of that 1,000 years, a good place to be a Jew. Judaism flourished. Russia comes later. Russia is not a center of Jewish life until it conquers in the late 1700s, part of what was considered Poland. All right. So let's flow ahead here. So the Jews speak Yiddish because it's a German version with Hebrew in it. And that becomes their natural language. And this becomes the Minhag Ashkenaz. So by 16th century, you have 50,000 Jews. Still, there's many in the Sephardic world. And but it grows. Between 1500 and 1648, it soars to 500,000. It becomes the largest Jewish community in the world. And Jewish life flourishes there. Yeshivas and communities and towns. And it's similar, it follows the patterns of the German Jewish community, which is the Kahal, an organization of the head community. They collect taxes. They have even a semi-autonomy called the Council of the Four Lands the Jews have at the time. So they defend the Jews when they can. They work with the governments when they can, all sorts of commerce. But the Jews end up being the middlemen between the Polish landowning nobility and the serfs, which does cause anti-Semitism as well. The Jews are able to sell alcoholic beverages and rent and lease these arendas, these inns. So the relationship is complicated. Again, the similar idea with the nobility, at times getting rid of their debts from the Jews and other times using the Jews as a buffer. So the shtetl are these little towns spread out. Many of them are pure Jewish communities, or mostly Jewish communities, where you live a life of proud Jewishness as the natural flow. So I would suggest a book by Heschel called The Earth is the Lord's, a very short book, and it's usually together with the book The Sabbath, which describes Jewish life in Eastern Europe, what it was like. So the shtetl declines because of the major cities and different new ideologies. We'll come back to that. So what happens is, we're going through the spiritual leaders, the religious centers, hundreds of synagogues, hundreds of communities, autonomy. Yiddish is the mama lashon. So I want to talk about, I want to skip through anti-Semitism. We did enough about that. I want to talk about acculturation and about assimilation. And what happens here is you have the Khmelnytsky massacres that take place, the Cossacks against the Polish nobility in the year Tach, which is 1648 in the secular. And they massacred, he says, thousands, tens of thousands, some say hundreds of thousands. But one thing for sure, we know thousands of towns were decimated. Jewish life in Europe was devastated in Eastern Europe, in Poland, where most of the Jews were at the time. So what happens in 1648, the Jewish people are at a terrible place, and the poverty that they sink into creates a problem for the future. Then we have other problems. Sweden, we have a long war that goes on, lots of problems, more taxation. And then what happens is Poland is divided up by Russia, Austria, and Prussia. So you have this division again, fragmentation, and that's how Jews end up in all these different countries, because the majority of the Jews had been in Poland, of the Ashkenazic Jews at the time. So Russia takes the largest portion, and that Jews end up being hundreds of thousands of Jews under Russia. But Russia doesn't know how to deal with the Jews, and they deal in a harsh way. They try to forcibly assimilate them in many ways, create the Pale of Settlement. And there's a constant tension of how they deal with the Jews. They put the Jews in one part called the Pale of Settlement, and there were different conflicting. You had those that wanted to convert them to Christianity, to Christian Orthodoxy, and they kidnapped Jewish soldiers from the age of 8 or 9 children and made them into soldiers. All sorts of terrible decrees, and fluctuating between these different approaches of Russian leadership. But the Jewish community still continued to grow. Now, what happens is Prussia, Austria, ultimately France, and Germany ends up with emancipation under Napoleon. And this creates a schism in the Jewish world. You have the traditional Jews who are still under Russian oppression, and you have the Jews who are in Western Europe who have initially lots of freedom. And this freedom was at the expense, they felt, and they got the message, to be a Jew in the home and a man outside, a person, a civilian, a citizen. To the Jew as an individual, everything. As a religion, we're not giving them anything. In other words, they don't want the Jews as a nationality. So the idea of the Jews as a nation, they wanted the Jews to be loyal to their countries and to assimilate and acculturate. And they believed if they gave the Jews enough opportunity, we would all become enough like them. We'd be Jews infused, and we would not have such a problem. The Jews in Russia did not have that luxury. And what's fascinating is that freedom that takes place in Western Europe does lead to an accelerated assimilation, acculturation, intermarriage, and ultimately conversion for many, 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 many Jews. Because to get higher up, they still hit the glass ceiling, which was not that high for a Jew. And but as they became more assimilated and acculturated, it was easier for them to leave their religion. And that's happening in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, there's also times of forced policy to get them to convert, but the Jews don't. It's Western Europe where we have the assimilation happening, which is why most Jews today in America are going to be products of Jews that came from Russia, because others acculturated, assimilated at a much higher rate. So we'll leave aside some of the details of the Pale of Settlement. We have the rise of the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement takes place after the Khmelnytsky massacres and after the false Messiah Shabtai Tzvi in 1666, where the Jewish hopes were dashed. The Jewish people were depressed, downtrodden, poverty-stricken in Eastern Europe, and the Hasidic movement comes to uplift them. There is opposition because they're afraid of change, rightfully so, because the only way traditional Judaism can survive is if it's very careful about foreign influences coming in. In addition, there's political power that shifts from the community to people following a tzaddik. It's no more centralized. Part of this was an extension of Russian rule, that the Russians had gotten rid of much of the autonomous nature of the Jewish communities, and so did these other countries. So the kehila, the community, the kol was weakened, and many of those people saw as a danger that the Hasidic movement was also shifting these lines of power. All right. So we have the Hasidic movement, those who were against it. We did Polish decline, the rise of Hasidism. Ultimately, the antagonists of Hasidism, who are known as the Misnagdim, they see that the Jewish people are under a much greater threat. Plus, they saw all the different reasons they were afraid of Hasidism. They were going to change Judaism in a way of less observance, less Torah, etc., was unfounded. So what happens is that they reconcile, but also for another reason, because they see the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, which sounds like a great word, and for many it was the idea of how do we integrate more in the Eastern European with the society here as the Jews in Western Europe. Now, if you're a traditional Jew, you're worried about that because you saw what happened to Western Europe. You saw the acculturation leading to assimilation, leading to conversion, leading to people leaving their religion. So the Haskalah was seen by the Jews of Eastern Europe as a danger. The Russian government liked it. They were going to support it in many ways because this would make the Jews better citizens the less distinct they were. All right, so what happens is the Haskalah, we have Moses Mendelssohn in Germany, who was an observant Jew himself, but he's the father of what becomes a reform movement. His own children convert to Christianity ultimately. And Felix Mendelssohn, etc. I think one stayed Jewish. They all married non-Jews. Why? Because to move up the ranks, that's what it was. They all disappeared. We have no memory of these people, all those early adherents. All right, so the Jewish Haskalah is a challenge, but what it leads to is disappointment after disappointment after disappointment that creates different Jewish movements. What I mean to say is in Eastern Europe, when the Haskalah, when the Enlightenment thinks we're going to get rid of anti-Semitism by becoming more acculturated and assimilated, the pogroms by the nobility, by the Tsar, showed them that there was no hope for that. And ultimately, then they become socialists, and that doesn't work. They become communists, and they become Zionists. I mean, I'm not going in order here. But all these isms looking for a way that will lead them to some form of emancipation, some form of independence, some form of security. They embrace these different movements, but hoping always for the help of the Gentile. Zionism says, enough, we can't handle it, we're going to leave. But they're all the illegitimate child, so to speak, of Haskalah and of these different movements. Of course, within the nationalism of the Jew, there was also intertwined elements of Torah observant ideas. But at its core, as we'll see, Zionism saw as the ultimate expression of how we tried to get rid of anti-Semitism every which way. We converted, it didn't help. We assimilated, it didn't help. We acculturated, it didn't help. We westernized, it didn't help. We need our own state. This is what leads to Zionism, so to speak. And not just that, to a great degree, it becomes the model of a new definition of the Jew. Not like Reform and Conservative that get rid of certain elements that make us more distinct, because there's a twofold approach in Reform. On one hand, there are those that think they're saving Judaism by doing what people will keep. On the other hand, there are those that think if we can assimilate and acculturate more, we'll be accepted if we're more like the Protestants that surround us. It didn't help, but there was that belief. So you have all those elements that Dash ends up building up Eastern and Western Zionism. So we have this rapid assimilation, rapid conversion that takes place. Let me just close up. I think I'm not going to do another class on the history. We'll move into other elements, but I just want to be able to on one foot. What happens is the early modern period is when you have different denominations of Judaism begin to grow. They begin to grow because of the Enlightenment and because of the equality and emancipation that the Jews have, and they're able to integrate more fully with those societies, and they feel, and they're told, that the price to pay is to be more like, less tribal, and more a citizen of Berlin, a citizen of Paris, a citizen of the country, rather than this amorphous Jewish people yearning to return to Eretz Yisrael and Mashiach. And what happens is that those hopes are dashed. And they're dashed in the late 1800s. A million Jews moved to America. Earlier in the 1850s, Jews left from Germany because after all that hope, they also go to America. And then later on, we see what happens ultimately with the Holocaust, and before that, World War I. There's a tremendous amount of persecution in Poland. So all the progress Jews were making in Poland, in Russia, through every period, ultimately is dashed. So there are those that say we have to rely on God, and others say, no, we're going to create a new definition. And this is the core of where Zionism is. So Zionism is both a place to let Jews survive, which everyone agrees is a noble cause. But then there were others that were very concerned about this idea of creating a new definition of a Jew, that the Torah and the Talmud and the oral tradition and all that was seen as a crutch. That you don't have a land, so you had religion. And religion is just a crutch, and really we have to go back to these communist ideals or socialist ideals or atheistic ideals. That was much of the leadership was promoting that. Although there was a small group of religious Jews who saw this as a fulfillment of divine prophecy of the Jews returning to the land as a precursor to Mashiach. So, but as a whole, there was antagonism. So what happens is, I mean, the rest of our story, we know we have the Holocaust that decimates Jewish life in 2/3 of the Jews of the world, and most of the Jews of Europe are wiped out, killed, and some are saved from Russia. And then after the war, we have the establishment of the State of Israel and tremendous miracles in 48 and 67, 73. All the different wars the Arabs tried to conquer the Jewish people and to annihilate them, and thank God. And then we have these, from that beginning though, you had the issues and the elements where you had discussion about how much can we give the Arabs and have them love us again, which is all this territorial compromise that's been taking place from the very beginning before even the establishment of the Jewish state. Historical Palestine, as was known, the biblical land of the Jews, is divided up twice, 3 times, and given to different Arab countries to make states out of. So ultimately, the Jewish people today still are not sure about what they're going to give the Arabs in order for the Arabs to love them, while the rest of the Middle East is collapsing upon itself. So that was my political excursion, just because I have to talk about the modern times as well. Jews in America in many ways are thriving. On one hand, we've never been able to have this much freedom. On the other hand, tremendous amount of assimilation, acculturation, not necessarily in that order. And this is a challenge that we have to be a Jew by choice today in this world. And tremendous renaissance of the Jews in Russia, and in much of where that was brought about clearly by the Rebbe. But serious challenges facing the Jewish world today. But one thing we know, the Guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. And despite the challenges facing us as a people, we are clear that we will persevere and we will ultimately reach the end of our journey with Mashiach.